The human brain consumes enormous energy even when nothing is happening, even when the body is still, even when the eyes are closed. From an evolutionary point of view, this makes no sense. Nature usually removes what wastes energy, yet the human brain never learned how to slow down. It keeps scanning, predicting, remembering, replaying, long after danger is gone. We did not evolve to rest our minds. We evolved to survive by never fully turning them off. And that survival advantage may now be the very reason modern humans struggle to sleep, to be present, and to feel mentally at peace. So the question is not why the brain works so hard, but why evolution never taught it how to stop. The human brain never evolved with peace as its default state. Long before comfort, stability, or quiet environments existed, the brain's primary role was to keep the body alive in conditions that were unstable, unpredictable. For early humans, stillness was rarely safe. Silence did not mean calm. It often meant vulnerability. A quiet environment could hide predators, rival groups, or sudden environmental shifts. Because of this, the brain developed not as a system designed to relax, but as one designed to constantly monitor what might go wrong next. Even when the body stopped moving, the mind continued to scan, compare, and anticipate. This is not a malfunction. It is a biological inheritance shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of survival pressure. From the earliest stages of human evolution, individuals whose brains slowed down too easily were less likely to detect danger early, less likely to respond quickly, and less likely to survive long enough to reproduce. Over time, natural selection favored brains that remained active, even in the absence of immediate threats. This meant maintaining internal alertness during moments that appear from a modern perspective unnecessary. The human nervous system was shaped in an environment where certainty was rare and delay could be fatal. As a result, the brain learned that slowing down completely carried risk. It learned that constant background activity increased the odds of survival. This principle became embedded in the architecture of the brain itself, particularly in systems responsible for attention, memory, and threat detection. When modern humans lie still, close their eyes, and attempt to rest, the brain does not interpret this as safety by default. Instead, it treats stillness as a transitional state that requires continued monitoring. The brain continues to replay past experiences, simulate future possibilities, and evaluate internal sensations. These processes once served a direct evolutionary function. Remembering where danger occurred prevented repetition of fatal mistakes. All of these functions required sustained mental activity, not silence. Importantly, the brain did not evolve in environments where prolonged mental quiet was advantageous. There was no selective pressure rewarding individuals who could mentor. Mental disengagement could mean missing subtle environmental cues that indicated approaching danger. The idea of mental rest as a biological goal is largely a modern concept shaped by environments that offer relative safety, predictability, and external protection. In ancestral conditions, safety was temporary and often fragile. The brain adapted accordingly, prioritizing readiness over rest. This is why, even today, in environments that are objectively safe, the brain continues to behave as if vigilance is required. It does not distinguish well between ancient threats and modern discomforts. A troubling thought, an unresolved social interaction, or an uncertain future event can activate the same internal systems that once responded to predators. The brain does not slow down because it was never trained by evolution to recognize peace as a stable condition. It was trained to assume that peace is temporary and that preparation must continue. Understanding this reframes the modern experience of mental restlessness. It is not evidence of weakness, failure, or dysfunction. It is the expression of a brain doing exactly what it was shaped to do: remain active, remain alert, and remain prepared in a world that once demanded nothing less. To understand why the brain learned to avoid slowing down, it is necessary to return to the specific conditions in which early humans lived. For most of human evolutionary history, life unfolded in environments where stability was rare and danger was often subtle rather than dramatic. Threats did not always announce themselves loudly. A predator could remain hidden in tall grass. A rival group could observe silently before acting. A sudden change in weather could turn a familiar landscape into a lethal one within hours. In such conditions, survival depended not on bursts of intense attention, but on sustained awareness over long periods of time. The brain adapted to these demands by maintaining a continuous low-level state of readiness. This meant staying mentally active, even when no immediate danger was visible. Slowing down completely would have created blind spots, moments where critical information could be missed. Over generations, individuals whose brains remained engaged were more likely to notice small irregularities, a sound out of place, a change in animal behavior, an unusual silence. These signals often mattered more than obvious threats. As a result, evolution favored brains that treated uncertainty itself as a reason to stay active. Importantly, early humans did not have external systems to manage risk. There were no secure shelters, no artificial lighting to extend vision into the night, no medical interventions to correct mistakes. The brain was the primary tool for managing uncertainty, and it had to work continuously even during periods of physical rest. This is why rest in evolutionary terms was rarely complete disengagement. Instead, it was a shift from physical effort to internal monitoring. The brain continued to track memory, evaluate social relations within the group, and simulate future scenario humans to plan movements, anticipate conflicts and maintain social cohesion, all of which directly affected survival. Thus, slowing the brain too much would have reduced this capacity. Over time, the nervous system learned to associate reduced mental activity with increased vulnerability. This association became deeply embedded. Even when the environment appeared calmness as safety, calmness could simply mean that danger had not yet revealed itself. From an evolutionary perspective, assuming safety too early was more dangerous than remaining cautious too long. This asymmetry shaped how the brain responds to quiet moments. Instead of powering down, it fills silence with thought. It replays memories, scans bodily sensations, and imagines possible futures. They are expressions of a system opined to detect problems before they become visible. In modern environments, where threats are rarely immediate or physical, this same mechanism can feel excessive. However, the brain does not evaluate modern safety accurately because it was not shaped by modern conditions. It continues to operate under assumptions formed in environments where slowing down carried a measurable risk. The key point is that the brain's resistance to slowing down is not stubbornness or dysfunction. It is the result of long-term adaptation to environments where uncertainty was constant and mistakes were costly. The brain learned that vigilance was safer than relaxation. This lesson was repeated across thousands of generations and became part of the brain's baseline operating mode. When modern humans struggle to quiet their minds, they are experiencing the echo of this evolutionary history. The brain is responding not to the present moment alone, but to a deeply ingrained model of the world where slowing down meant exposure, and exposure often meant death. The legacy of this evolutionary environment is carried directly into the modern human experience. Although external conditions have changed dramatically, the internal operating rules of the brain remain largely the same. The brain does not measure safety by comfort, technology, or social stability. It measures safety by predictability and control, both of which were historically limited. As a result, modern forms of uncertainty activate ancient systems that were originally designed to keep early humans alive. A vague worry about the future, an unresolved social tension, or even an unfinished task can trigger the same internal alert mechanisms that once responded to physical threats. The brain treats these signals seriously because in its evolutionary history, unresolved uncertainty often precedes it. When external stimulation decreases, the brain compensates by increasing internal stimulation. Silence and darkness reduce sensory input, but they do not signal safety to the brain. Instead, they create conditions similar to those faced by early humans at night, when visibility was low and vulnerability was high. In response, the brain intensifies internal monitoring rather than relaxing. This process is especially visible during attempts to sleep. The modern human lies in a secure environment, yet the brain continues to replay conversations, imagine future outcomes, and scan the body for irregular sensations. From an evolutionary perspective, this behavior is logical. Predators hunted under cover of darkness, and social conflicts were harder to predict. The brain adapted by maintaining partial alertness even during rest. Sleep itself evolved not as total shutdown, but as a controlled reduction of responsiveness. The brain never fully disengaged. It remained capable of waking the body quickly if necessary. This design persists. The inability to slow the brain is therefore not a failure to relax, but a continuation of a protective mechanism. Importantly, the brain does not distinguish well between external danger and internal uncertainty. Thoughts about work, relationships, or identity are processed through the same circuits that once handled survival-relevant information. The brain assumes that any unresolved issue may carry consequences, and so it keeps working on it. This is why attempts to force the brain into silence often fail from the brain's perspective. Silence without resolution feels unsafe. Slowing down without explanation contradicts its evolutionary. In the absence of clarity, it chooses activity. Recognizing this helps reframe modern mental restlessness. The brain is not resisting rest out of defiance. It is acting in accordance with deeply embedded assumptions about how the world works. These assumptions were accurate for most of human history. Only recently has the environment changed enough that constant vigilance is no longer necessary for physical survival. Yet evolution operates slowly. The brain remains tuned to conditions that shaped it, not to the comfort of the present moment. This mismatch between ancient design and modern life explains why the human brain never truly slows down. It is not because it cannot, but because for most of its existence, slowing down was never safe. Understanding this evolutionary mismatch does not immediately quiet the mind, but it provides context. It explains why mental activity persists, even when rest is desired. It sets the foundation for exploring how other evolutionary developments, such as prediction, memory, language, and social complexity, further reinforce the brain's resistance to slowing down. These layers will be examined in the following chapter, as the narrative moves from foundation design to the specific mechanisms that keep the human brain in constant motion. One of the most important reasons the human brain never slows down is that it evolved as a prediction machine rather than a reaction machine. Early humans who waited to react after danger appeared were often too late. Survival depended on anticipating what might happen next before it happened. This requirement shaped the brain to constantly project itself forward in time, constructing possible futures from incomplete information. Long before written history, long before settled societies, the human brain learned that the present moment was rarely enough. What mattered was what could happen moments, hours, or days later. A rustling sound could mean wind, but it could also mean a predator preparing to strike. A change in weather patterns could mean nothing, or it could signal famine because the cost of being wrong was high. The brain adapted by running continuous simulations. It learned to imagine multiple outcomes simultaneously and to update those models constantly. This process required an ongoing mental activity. Even when nothing appeared to be happening externally, prediction became safer than passivity over time. This predictive function became central to human cognition. The brain did not wait for certainty. It operated on probabilities. It learned to ask, what is most likely to happen next? And what would be the cost if I am unprepared? This question never required full answers. It only required continued thinking in evolutionary terms. A brain that kept predicting had an advantage over a brain that paused. Pausing meant losing the opportunity to prepare. This is why the brain treats stillness as an opportunity to think ahead rather than to rest. When the body stops moving, the brain does not interpret this as completion. It interprets it as available time to run simulations. These simulations were once directly linked to survival decisions: where to move, when to flee, whom to trust, and how to conserve resources. Prediction allowed early humans to reduce physical risk by resolving uncertainty mentally. First, This is a critical evolutionary point. Mental effort replaced some physical trial and error. Instead of learning only through injury or death, humans could learn by imagining outcomes. This shift dramatically improved survival rates, but it came with a cost. The brain became accustomed to operating continuously. Because prediction has no natural stopping point, there is always another possible future to consider. From the brain's perspective, slowing down prediction feels like abandoning preparation. This logic made sense in ancestral environments where tomorrow's conditions were unknown and often dangerous. The brain did not need certainty to keep predicting. Uncertainty itself was enough to justify non-activity. Modern humans still carry this predicted architecture. The brain continues to simulate physics, even when the stakes are no longer fits, a future conversation, a financial decision, or a personal choice, acting at the same systems that once predicted weather patterns or predator behavior. The brain does not differentiate between types of uncertainty. It treats all unresolved future when trying to rest. Lying still removes extra demand bands, but it also removes distractions. The brain uses this quiet to intensify prediction. It reviews the past to refine future models and projects forward to reduce uncertainty. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is efficient use of downtime. Resting the body created space for the mind to prepare. Slowing the brain would have wasted that opportunity. The human brain never learned when to stop predicting because, historically, prediction was always useful. There was no clear signal that said preparation was complete. This is the foundation of why the brain resists slowing down. It was built to stay one step ahead of a world that rarely offered guarantees. That design persists. Even when modern life no longer requires constant vigilance for physical survival, the prediction proved useful for survival. It did not remain a temporary strategy. Over time, it became a stable habit embedded into the brain's structure. Neural systems responsible for anticipating grew more interconnected and more active. The brain did not merely predict when necessary, it learned to predict by default. This shift mattered deeply. A system that acts only when danger appears can rest in between. A system that treats uncertainty itself as a signal cannot. For early humans, uncertainty was constant. Food availability changed, social alliances shifted, and environmental conditions were rarely predictable. This background activity did not require conscious effort at first. It became automatic over generations. Brains that maintained ongoing prediction were favored because they reduced exposure to surprise. Surprise, in evolutionary terms, often meant injury or deathing for multiple possible futures. This preparation did not stop when one problem was solved. Solving one uncertainty often revealed another. Predict chained itself forward endlessly. This is a critical reason the brain never slows down. Prediction has no natural end to it. There is always another scenario to consider, another variable to adjust, another outcome to weigh. Unlike physical tasks which end when the body stops moving, mental prediction continues as long as uncertainty exists. And in human life, uncertainty is rarely eliminated entirely. Even when immediate needs are met, future conditions remain unknown. The brain responds by staying active. Importantly, the more the brain predicted, the more it noticed patterns. The more patterns it noticed, the more it believed prediction was effective. This created a feedback loop. Prediction reduced some risks, which reinforced the belief that prediction was necessary over time. The brain began to interpret reduced prediction as negligence. Not thinking ahead felt dangerous. This internal logic did not depend on actual threats. It depended on learned association in ancestral environments. Thinking ahead often prevented harm. Therefore, the brain concluded that thinking ahead was always safer than not. This conclusion persists today. When modern humans try to slow their minds, the brain experiences this as a withdrawal from a protective behavior. It responds by increasing activity, not decreasing it, that it only registers a reduction in monitoring. To compensate, it intensifies prediction. This is why the mind often becomes busier when external demands stop. The brain fills the gap with simulations. It revisits past experiences to refine its models and projects forward to test possible outcomes. Instead of acting impulsively, early humans could think through consequences. However, this efficiency came at the cost of continuous mental motion. The brain became comfortable with motion and uncomfortable with stillness. From an evolutionary perspective, stillness without prediction offered no advantage. Therefore, no biological mechanism evolved to signal with certainty that prediction could safely stop. Modern humans often misinterpret this as anxiety or overthinking, but at its core, it is a deeply ingrained habit shaped by survival demands. The brain is not malfunctioning. It is applying an ancient strategy to a modern environment. The problem is not that the brain predicts too much, but that the environment no longer provides clear signals that prediction is no longer needed. Without those signals, the brain continues doing what it learned to do best: stay active, stay ahead, and never assume that the future is fully under control. Not predicts alone was not enough to keep early humans alive. To predict effectively, the brain needed reliable material to work with, and that material came from memory. Over time, memory and prediction became tightly bound into a single system. The past was no longer something to be stored and forgotten. It became raw data for anticipating the future. Experiences that carried risk were especially important. Encounters with danger, loss, or social conflict were encoded deeply because they provided information that could prevent repetition. The brain learned that remembering was not about accuracy or completeness, but about usefulness. What mattered was whether a memory could help predict what might happen next. This connection transformed memory into an active process rather than a passive archive. The brain did not wait for cues to recall information. It pulled memories forward whenever uncertainty appeared. This is why thinking about the future so often triggers the past. The brain searches backward to move forward. In evolutionary terms, this made sense. If a certain path led to danger, once recalling that memory could prevent fatal mistakes later. If a social interaction resulted in conflict, the brain therefore learned to keep memory accessible at all times. It did not store experiences quietly, it kept them ready for use. This readiness required ongoing mental activity. Even when the environment appeared calm, the brain continued reviewing past events, refining predictions, and adjusting expectations. From the brain's perspective, reflection was preparation. This created another layer of continuous motion. Prediction pushed the brain forward, memory pulled it backward, and the present moment became a narrow space between the two. The brain rarely stayed there. Instead, it oscillated constantly between what had happened and what might happen. Internal uncertainty was enough over generations. Brains that maintained this tight coupling between memory and prediction were more adaptable. They learned faster, avoided repeated errors, and navigated complex social environments more effectively. As human societies grew more complex, social survival required remembering who could be trusted, who had betrayed alliances, and how previous interactions had unfolded. Prediction depended on accurate recall. As a result, memory became increasingly active and intrusive. It did not wait to be summoned. It surfaced automatic when the brain sensed bursts in modern humans. When the brain tries to predict future outcomes, it often drags past experiences into awareness without permission. This can feel like rumination, but from an evolutionary standpoint, it is functional. The brain is assembling data to reduce uncertainty. The problem is that modern uncertainties are often abstract and prolonged. The brain continues searching memory for solutions that may not exist, because there is no clear end point. The loop continues. Prediction feeds on memory, and memory feeds prediction. Together, they form a self-sustaining cycle that keeps the brain active even in the absence of physical threats. This explains why the brain often feels busiest when external demands are lowest. With fewer sensory inputs, the internal system has more space to operate. The brain does not slow down because its core functions are still engaged. It is still predicting, still learning, still preparing. Yet the brain cannot easily distinguish between the two. It applies the same rules it always has. This completes the picture of why prediction alone locks the brain into motion. When combined with memory, it creates a system that naturally resists stillness. The brain remains active, not because it is broken, but because it is doing exactly what evolution shaped it to do. Use the past to prepare for the future, continuously and without pause. Memory did not evolve to preserve the past for emotional reflection or personal activity. Its original function was far more practical and far more severe. For early humans, memory was a survival tool, sharpened by consequence. Experiences that led to harm were not simply remembered. They were marked, brawnatized, and made difficult to forget. The brain learned quickly that forgetting could be fatal. A mistake repeated was often a mistake that ended a life. Because of this, memory became selective rather than neutral. It did not store everything evenly. It emphasized events tied to danger, loss, pain, or social rupture. This bias was not accidental, it was adaptive. A brain that remembered threats more vividly than comforts was better equipped to avoid future harm. Over time, this bias shaped how memory operates at a fundamental level. Memory became a warning system, not a diary. This explains why negative experiences are often recalled more easily and more frequently than positive ones. In ancestral environments, pleasure did not usually carry survival information. Danger did. As a result, memory evolved to hold on to what went wrong. This design choice kept early humans alive, but it also ensured that the brain would never be free from its past. Memories were not meant to fade quietly. They were meant to resurface when needed. The brain did not wait for permission to recall them. It brought them forward whenever it detected patterns that resembled previous threats. This meant that memory remained active even when nothing appeared to be happening. The brain was constantly comparing the present moment with stored experiences, searching for overlap. If similarity was detected, memory was activated. This proring down memory would have reduced the brain's ability to recognize danger. Therefore, memory systems evolved to remain accessible and responsive. This accessibility came at the cost of mental quiet. The brain became a place where the past was always available, never fully archived. Importantly, memory did not evolve to be accurate in a historical sense. It evolved to be useful. Details that increased survival odds were emphasized, while irrelevant details were discarded. This is why memory often feels distorted or incomplete. It is not trying to tell the full story. It is trying to prevent repetition of harm from the brain's perspective. Accuracy mattered less than preparedness. This priority further increased mental activity. The brain continuously reviewed and updated memories to improve future responses. Each recall was an opportunity to adjust predictions. This meant memory was not static. It was dynamic and constantly interacting with present perception. This reflex ensured survival in unpredictable environments, but it also guaranteed that the brain would remain busy even during moments of rest. Memory could intrude if the brain sensed unresolved risk. Modern humans inherit this system unchanged. The brain continues to treat memory as a tool for protection rather than reflection. It replays conversations, mistakes, and conflicts not to cause distress, but to prevent future errors. The problem is that modern life often presents problems without clear solutions. Social tensions may persist, mistakes may not be correctable. The memory keeps resurfacing because, from an evolutionary standpoint, unresolved situations are dangerous. The brain does not understand that some modern problems do not require immediate action. It applies the same rules. It always has. Memory stays active because it was never designed to rest. It was designed to warn, to remind, and to protect. This is why the brain cannot easily slow down. Its memory systems are not background features. They are empty defenses, and defenses, once activated by evolution, do not stand down easily. The human brain does not remember it family because F was shaped by unequal consequences. In ancestral environments, negative outcomes carried far more weight than positive ones. The pleasant experience rarely changed survival odds, but a harmful one could end a life because of this imbalance. The brain evolved a strong bias toward remembering what went wrong. This is often called a negativity bias, but in evolutionary terms it is better understood as a risk-weighted memory system. Experiences linked to pain, fear, social rejection or loss were encoded more deeply because they contained information that could prevent future harm. Forgetting these experiences increased vulnerability. Remembering them even repeatedly increased survival chances. Over time, this bias became automatic. The brain learned to treat negative memories as high-priority signals that required continued attention. This priority did not fade quickly. Unlike neutral information which could be stored and left untouched, threat-related memories remained active. They resurfaced easily and often, especially when the brain sensed uncertainty. This design ensured that past dangers remained visible in the present. Slowing down this process would have weakened the brain's ability to avoid repeating mistakes. Therefore, memory systems evolved to stay alert rather than dormant. This is why the brain tends to replay embarrassing moments, failures, or conflicts more persistently than successes. From a survival perspective, success required no correction. Failure demanded analysis. The brain reviewed negative events not to punish the individual. Each replay was an attempt to refine future behavior. However, this refinement process had no built-in limit. The brain did not evolve a clear signal that said a lesson had been fully learned in ancestral conditions. Revisiting a dangerous memory multiple times increased the likelihood that the associated behavior. As a result, the brain favored repeated recall over closure. This created a system where memory loops were not a flaw but a feature. The more serious the potential consequence, the more persistent the memory. This persistence ensured vigilance, but it also guaranteed ongoing mental activity. Even during periods of physical safety, the brain continued to scan memory for unresolved risks. It did not require external triggers. Internal states such as fatigue, quiet, or reduced stimulation were enough to activate recall. In evolutionary terms, these states resemble vulnerability. The brain responded by increasing mental vigilance. Negative memories resurface to maintain caution. This mechanism persists today. When modern humans attempt to rest, the reduction of external input creates conditions similar to ancestral vulnerability. It replays them not because they are relevant, but because the system is doing what it was trained to do. The problem is that modern risks are often social, psychological, or symbolic rather than physical. There is no immediate action that resolves them. The brain continues replaying memories because it expects that repetition will eventually produce a solution. When none appears, the loop continues. This leads to mental fatigue without resolution. Yet the brain does not interpret fatigue as a reason to stop. In evolutionary history, stopping review before danger was resolved. Increased risk, therefore the brain persists. Understanding this helps explain why mental quiet is so difficult to achieve. The brain is not biased toward peace. It is biased toward safety. And in its ancient logic, safety requires remembering what hurt, what failed, and what threatened survival. This bias ensures that the brain remains active long after the original event has passed. It is not holding on to the past for emotional reasons. It is holding on to it. Because for most of human history, forgetting was more dangerous than remembering. This priority is deeply embedded and continues to shape how the brain behaves in moments of rest. The inability to slow down is not accidental. It is the outcome of a memory system that was designed to protect life, not to preserve calm. When memory evolved as a protective system, it did not stop at recalling past dangers. It also learned to anticipate emotional and social consequences. As human groups grew larger and more complex, survival depended not only on avoiding predators, but on maintaining social position. Trust and cooperation. Being excluded from a group could be as dangerous as a physical threat. Memory adapted accordingly. Social mistakes, conflicts, and moments of rejection were encoded with particular intensity. The brain learned that social errors could lead to loss of protection, resources, and allies. Therefore, these memories were treated as threats that required ongoing attention. This expanded the role of memory beyond immediate physical danger and into the realm of prolonged psychological vigilance. The brain did not evolve to process social experiences. It evolved to revisit them repeatedly, searching for patterns and corrections. Each replay was an attempt to prevent future exclusion or conflict. This process did not require conscious choice. It happened automatically whenever the brain sensed an unresolved social activity. The brain was no longer just protecting the body. It was protecting identity, status, and belonging. These concerns had no clear resolution point. Physical threats could be escaped or confronted. Social threats often lingered, relations were fragile, and intentions were ambiguous. The brain responded by keeping memory active indefinitely. This is a key reason why the human brain feels busy even in safe environments. Modern humans inherit a memory system that treats unresolved social and emotional experiences as ongoing risks. When the external world quiets down, these internal concerns rise to the surface. The brain uses stillness to revisit them, not because they are urgent in the present moment, but because historically they were. Quiet moments resemble vulnerability in ancestral settings. Isolation or inactivity increased risk of social and physical danger. The brain learned to compensate by increasing internal vigilance. This is why mental activity often intensifies at night or during rest. The brain is filling the perceived gap in protection with thought. Over time, this constant replay can feel like anxiety, but at its core, it is an extension of memory's survival function. The brain is trying to prevent future harm by refining its understanding of past events. It is attempting to anticipate how similar situations might unfold again. The problem is that modern social environments generate far more situations than the brain evolved to handle. Interactions are frequent, complex, and often unresolved. Memory keeps collecting material without clear closure. This overload increases mental noise as a signal to stop in evolutionary history. Stopping review too early increased vulnerability. Therefore, the brain continues. It creates the modern experience of a mind that never fully rests. Memory remains active because it was never meant to disengage. It was meant to protect life and belonging in environments where both were constantly at risk. The result is a brain that carries its past into every quiet moment. This completes the arc of why memory contributes so strongly to the brain's inability to slow down. It is not a flaw of modern life alone. It is the outcome of a system designed to guard survival through constant recall repetition. Anticipation. The brain does not let go easily because letting go once meant losing everything. Understanding this helps clarify why mental restlessness persists even when danger is absent. The brain is operating according to rules written long before modern safety existed. Those rules ensured survival, but they also ensured that memory would never truly sleep. With this foundation established, the next chunk will move forward to examine how the expansion of the human cortex amplified these mechanisms, increasing cognitive power while deepening mental unrest. As human evolution progressed, one of the most consequential changes was the rapid expansion of the cerebral cortex. It happened because it increased flexibility in dealing with complex changing environments. A larger cortex allowed early humans to integrate more information at once, to compare options and to adjust behavior without relying solely on instinct. This flexibility improved survival, but it also introduced a new cost. The cortex did not replace older brain systems. It layered itself on top of them. As a result, the human brain became a system where primitive survival circuits and advanced cognitive processes operated simultaneously. This layering meant that the brain gained the ability to think abstractly, but it did not lose its need for vigilance. The cortex amplified existing survival functions rather than quieting them. It added analysis, reflection, and imagination to systems that were already active. From an evolutionary standpoint, this was efficient. A brain that could think about danger in more sophisticated ways could avoid it more effectively. But this sophistication, the cortex does not wait for external threats to activate. It generates internal scenarios, evaluating hypothetical outcomes, and revisits past experiences, even in the absence of immediate danger. This is because its role is not limited to reaction. It is responsible for interpretation and meaning. Early humans benefited from being able to interpret ambiguous situations. Ambiguity required thought, comparison, and judgment. The cortex evolved to handle these demands by remaining active. Importantly, the expansion of the cortex dramatically increased energy consumption. The human brain uses a disproportionate amount of the body's energy relative to its size. From a purely biological perspective, this is inefficient. Evolution usually favors energy conservation, yet the cortex remained large and active because the benefits outweighed the cost. A brain that could model social dynamics, plan ahead, and adapt to new challenges had a higher chance of survival and reproduction. The cortex does not have a clear-off switch. Its function is to integrate information continuously. Even when sensory input decreases, the cortex continues working with internal data. It reflects on memory, simulates future actions, and evaluates internal states. Slowing down these processes pressure emerged to suppress cortical activity. To instead, the brain learned to use dandan for mental processing. Resting the body created opportunities for the cortex to work without distraction. This pattern persists today. When modern humans stop moving, the cortex does not interpret this as rest. It interprets it as time available for thinking. The cortex fills silence with analysis. This helps explain why mental activity often increases during attempts to relax. The more complex the cortex became, the more material it had to process. Language, social norms, and symbolic thinking expanded the range of possible concerns. Each new cognitive ability added another layer of mental motion. The cortex did not evolve to filter out unnecessary thought. It evolved to consider possibilities broadly from an evolutionary standpoint. Considering too much was safer than considering too little. This design ensured adaptability, but it also ensured restlessness. The transformed vigilance into reflection and prediction into rumination. Yet this transformation was not accidental. It was the price paid for intelligence. The brain never learned how to slow itself because slowing down would have reduced the very flexibility that made humans successful. This sets the stage for understanding why higher intelligence often correlates with increased mental noise rather than peace. Cortex gave humans the ability to think beyond the present, but it also trapped them in continuous mental activity. This evolutionary cost remains embedded in the structure of the brain itself. Not as the cortex expanded, it did not simply increase intended to uncertainty. Older brain systems responded to danger with relatively simple actions: fight, flee, or freeze. These responses were intense but short-lived. Once the threat passed, the response ended. The cortex altered this pattern by introducing evaluation without immediate action. Instead of responding once and stopping, the brain could now reconsider events repeatedly. This ability improved learning, but it also removed the natural endpoint that physical responses once provided. When danger was physical, action resolution was no longer clear. The cortex allowed humans to think about what could have happened differently, what might happen next time, and how similar situations could unfold in the future. This capacity for reflection had survival value, but it also meant that the brain could remain engaged long after the original event ended. The cortex does not require ongoing threat to stay active. It only requires unresolved meaning when an experience lacks. Clear interprets, compares, reframes, and revisits, searching for understanding. From an evolutionary standpoint, this was useful. Understanding patterns improved future decisions. However, it also meant that mental activity could persist indefinitely. The cortex learned to treat unresolved questions as problems that demanded attention. Silence and rest did not signal completion. They signaled opportunity. Without eternal demands, the cortex turned inward. This inward focus intensified mental noise rather than reducing it. Importantly, the cortex amplified emotional signals from older brain regions instead of dampening them. Fear, discomfort, and social pain were not silenced by thought. They were elaborated. The cortex added narrative to sensation. A simple feeling of unease could become a complex story about failure, rejection, or future loss. This narrative ability increased survival in social environments where understanding motives and consequences mattered. But it also meant that emotions no longer passed quickly. They were examined, interpreted, and prolonged. The brain became capable of worrying not only about what happened, but about what it meant. Temporary alerts into ongoing mental states. Evolution did not penalize this extension because it rarely caused immediate death. In fact, individuals who reflected more deeply on social and environmental cues often avoided future conflict. As a result, the cortex reinforced prolonged thinking rather than rapid closure. Over time, the brain learned that thinking longer felt safer than thinking less. Slowing down cognitive activity became associated with missing important details. This association persists when modern humans try to quiet their minds. The cortex resists. It interprets reduced thinking as neglect. It increases attempts to force mental calm often backfire. The cortex responds by generating more thoughts, not fewer. It is doing what it was shaped to do. Extract meaning, anticipate consequences, and reduce uncertainty. The problem is not that the cortex is overactive. It is that it has no clear criteria for stopping in ancestral environments. Stopping analysis too early increased risk. The cortex became a system oriented for ongoing interpretation rather than resolution. This explains why intelligence and mental restlessness often coexist. A more developed cortex provides greater cognitive flexibility, but it also creates more possibility weight. The result is a mind that rarely settles. This is not a malfunction of modern life alone. It is the logical outcome of an organ designed to think beyond the present moment. The cortex expanded human capability, but it also expanded the space in which thought could occur. With more space came more movement. The brain never learned how to slow down because slowing down would have meant relinquishing the very advantage the cortex say. This deepens the understanding of why mental activity persists even in safe, quiet environments. The cortex continues working because from its evolutionary perspective, thinking is protection. The biological cost of an expanded cortex. It is measurable and persistent. The human brain consumes a disproportionate share of the body's energy, even at rest. This energy demand does not drop significantly when the body becomes still. The cortex continues to process information, integrate signals, and generate internal activity regardless of external movement. From an evolutionary perspective, this constant energy use was justified. However, this advantage came with a long-term consequence: sustained mental fatigue. The cortex does not operate in bursts. It maintains baseline activity to remain flexible. This baseline creates continuous cognitive load, but mental exhaustion was less noticeable because life required constant engagement. In modern environments, physical demands have decreased, or cognitive demands have multiplied. The cortex now operates continuously without the balancing effect of fires the sense of mental tiredness. The brain is using energy as it always has, but the body is not dissipating that energy through movement. As a result, mental fatigue accumulates. Importantly, the cortex does not interpret fatigue as a signal to stop. In evolutionary history, fatigue did not mean safety. It often meant vulnerability. Slowing cognition could increase risk. Therefore, the brain evolved to push through mental fatigue rather than respond to it. This is why modern humans can feel mentally exhausted, yet unable to quiet their thoughts. The cortex continues working because its operating rules pro comfort. This persistence creates a paradox. The more the cortex works, the more energy it consumes, and the more fatigue is generated. Said, and can make thinking less efficient while keeping it active. This leads to looping thoughts, reduced clarity, and a sense of mental heaviness. From an evolutionary standpoint, Imperfect thinking was still better than no thinking. A tired brain could still detect threats, a silent brain could not. Therefore, evolution favored continuity over precision. This bias remains embedded in neuroregulation. Modern humans often attempt to resolve mental fatigue by seeking mental silence. However, the cortex was not designed to produce silence on command. It was designed to remain operational when silence is forced. The cortex often responds with increased internal activity, as if compensating for reduced external input. This reaction is not defiance. It is adaptation. The cortex assumes that reduced stimulation requires increased internal processing to maintain awareness. Over time, this dynamic contributes to chronic mental tiredness. The brain expends energy continuously, without a clear opportunity to reset. Sleep reduces responsiveness, but it does not fully shut down cortical activity. The cortex remains active even when consciousness fades. This explains why sleep does not always feel restorative. The brain has not stopped working, it has simply changed tasks. Understanding this biological cost reframes modern experiences of burnout and mental exhaustion. These states are not signs that the brain is failing. They are signs that the brain is operating according to ancient rules in an environment that never truly disengages it. The cortex evolved to handle complexity, but modern life presents complexity without interruption. The result is sustained cognitive load without relief. This completes the exploration of the cortical expansion. The brain gained intelligence, flexibility, and foresight, but it lost the ability to rest deeply. This trade-off was acceptable in evolutionary terms because it increased survival. In modern life, it manifests as a mind that feels permanently engaged. With this understanding, the narrative now moves toward the next chunk, where the focus will shift from internal biology to external social pressures, and how living among others further locked the human brain into constant activity. As human survival became increasingly dependent on living in groups, for the brain was forced to adapt to a new and persistent source of risk. Other humans, physical threats such as predators or environmental hazards, were no longer the only dangers that mattered. Access to food, protection, and long-term survival now depended heavily on social acceptance. Being part of a group offered safety, but it also introduced a constant layer of uncertainty. Unlike physical threats, social threats were rarely visible. Intentions could be concealed, alliances could change without warning, and exclusion could occur quietly. It learned to track tone of voice, facial expression, posture, hierarchy, and behavioral patterns in others. This monitoring could not be intermittent. Missing subtle social signals could result in loss of trust or removal from the group. Over time, social awareness became a permanent background process. The brain assumed that social dynamics were always shifting because in early human groups, they often were small changes in status or relationships could have serious consequences for survival. Memory and prediction systems were recruited to manage this complexity. Social interactions were stored not as neutral experiences, but as lessons. A disagreement, a sign of disapproval, or a moment of tension was recorded and revisited. The brain replayed these events to extract patterns and anticipate future outcomes. This helped individuals adjust behavior to maintain group cohesion. However, it also meant that social experience rarely ended when the interaction ended. The brain continued processing them afterward. There was no clear signal that social monitoring could stop. Even during periods of physical rest, the brain remained alert to potential changes in social standing. Silence did not signal safety in ancestral environments. Quiet periods could precede conflict, exclusion, or vulnerability. The brain learned to stay engaged. The brain continues to treat social uncertainty as a survival issue. Even when physical survival is no longer at stake, conversations are replayed, reactions are analyzed, and future interactions are simulated automatically. This is not a product of modern anxiety alone, it is the continuation of an ancient survival strategy. Therefore, the brain integrated social vigilance into its default operating mode. This explains why mental activity often centers on relationships, reputation, and belonging when external demands decrease. The brain uses quiet moments to scan for social risk because, historically, those moments were dangerous. Group living increased survival, but it also ensured that the brain would never fully rest. As long as belonging mattered, vigilance remained necessary. This social layer added another permanent source of mental activity. The brain was no longer only guarding the body or the future. It was guarding position within a group, and positions within groups were never stable. This evolutionary reality locked the brain into continuous social awareness, contributing directly to why it never truly slows down. Once social living became central to survival, the brain developed another demanding function: continuous self-evaluation. It was no longer enough to monitor others. Early humans also needed to constantly assess their own position within the group. Status determined access to shared resources, protection, and reproductive opportunities. A small drop in standing could have serious consequences. Because of this, the brain evolved to compare the self against others automatically. This comparison was not driven by vanity or ambition in the modern sense. It was driven by risk management. Knowing where one stood helped predict how others might behave. The brain learned to ask, often unconsciously, whether it was respected, tolerated, or at risk of exclusion. These questions required ongoing attention. Social comparison became a permanent background process. It did not wait for direct conflict. It operated continuously, scanning interactions. A glance, a tone change, or a lack of response could signal shifting status. The brain treated these signals seriously because historically they mattered. Memory amplified this process. Past social outcomes were recalled to guide present behavior. If a certain action once led to criticism or rejection, the brain remembered it vividly. It replayed the event to avoid repeating the mistake. This replay did not stop when the situation was resolved. It continued because future interactions were never guaranteed to be safe. The brain assumed that vigilance reduced risks to production. Self-evaluation became tightly linked to prediction. The brain compared the self not only to others in the present, but to imagine future versions of the self. It simulated how actions might affect reputation, trust, and belonging. This simulation required constant thought. There was no clear end point. As long as social life continued, the brain believed evaluation was necessary. The reduced self-monitoring could lead to social errors. Therefore, the brain maintained activity. This mechanism persists in modern humans, even when group survival is no longer directly at stake. The brain still compares, still evaluates, and still anticipates judgment. It does so automatically without conscious intent. Quiet moments intensify this process. It reviews past interactions and imagines future ones. This behavior once increased survival odds. Today it often creates mental fatigue, yet the brain does not recognize fatigue as a reason to stop. In evolutionary history, stopping evaluation too early increased NA. This is why attempts to mentally rest often results in increased self-criticism. The brain is trying to protect social standing, not to create discomfort. The problem is that modern social environments are larger, faster, and more abstract than anything. The brain evolved for the number of comparisons has increased, but the brain's regulatory systems have not changed. As a result, self-evaluation becomes relentless. The brain continues scanning for social risk even when none is present. This locks the mind into continuous activity. The human brain never learned how to turn off social comparison, because for most of its history, comparison was essential. Belonging was survival. This evolutionary pressure ensured that social self-monitoring would remain active, contributing directly to a mind that rarely slows down. When social vigilance became continuous, it reshaped not only how the brain monitored others and the self, but how it interpreted safety itself. In social species like humans, safety was no longer defined solely by the absence of physical threat. It was defined by belonging. Being accepted by the group meant access to shared protection. Being excluded meant exposure. Because exclusion rarely happened suddenly or visibly, the brain learned to watch for early signs. This required sustained attention. the brain became sensitive to ambiguity. Silence, distance, or subtle changes in behavior could signal danger. As a result, social vigilance did not switch off when interactions ended. It extended into quiet moments, filling them with analysis. The brain continued asking whether something had gone wrong, whether a signal was missed, or whether future interactions needed adjustment. This process created a constant low-level tension. The brain stayed active because social safety was never guaranteed. Unlike physical threats, which could often be escaped or confronted, social threats lingered. A damaged reputation could follow an individual for years. Alliances could weaken slowly. The brain responded by maintaining continuous monitoring. It did not evolve a clear end time for social concern. There was no moment when the brain could confidently conclude that belonging was secure. This uncertainty locked social vigilance into the brain's default state over time. This produced a sense of internal pressure. The brain remained alert, even in safe environments. Modern humans often experience this as unease, without a clear cause. From an evolutionary perspective, this unease was functional. It motivated caution and adaptability. However, in modern life where social structures are larger and less personal, the same mechanism becomes off signals with the same seriousness it once reserved for life-threatening exclusion. This creates persistent mental activity. Even when alone, the brain replays interactions and imagines future judgments. Quiet no longer feels neutral, it feels exposed. The brain fills that exposure with thought. This is why mental activity often increases when external noise decreases. The absence of distraction allows social vigilance to surface. The brain does not rest because rest wants increase social vulnerability. Fatigue does not override this logic in ancestral conditions. Social mistakes made during fatigue still had consequences. Therefore, the brain learned to remain alert despite tiredness. This contributes to the modern experience of mental exhaustion. The brain is carrying an ancient responsibility into an environment that no longer requires it in the same way. Social vigilance, once essential, now operates without clear limits. The result is a mind that feels constantly engaged, even when nothing is happening. This completes the exploration of how group living intensifies. The human brain never slows down, not only because it predicts and remembers, but because it guards belonging. Social survival added another permanent task to the brain's workload. Understanding this reveals that mental restlessness is not an individual failure. It is the consequence of a brain shaped to live among others, where acceptance meant life and exclusion meant danger. This social layer further entrenched the brain's resistance to slowing down, preparing the ground for the next stage of the narrative, where language and internal dialogue will deepen this continuous mental motion. Language introduced a profound shift in how the human brain operated. Before language, thought was closely tied to immediate perception and action. Sensations, emotions, and memories existed, but they did not unfold as continuous internal narratives. With the emergence of language, the brain gained the ability to represent experience symbolically. This allowed humans to describe events, communicate complex ideas to others. From an evolutionary standpoint, this was a powerful advantage. The language made coordination possible, strengthened group cohesion, and allowed knowledge to be transferred across generations. However, it also transformed the internal landscape of the mind. Thought no longer required external triggers. The brain could now generate meaning internally, using words as building blocks. This marked the beginning of continuous inner dialogue. Once language became internalized, the brain did not need the outside world to stimulate thinking. Words could trigger thoughts, and thoughts could trigger more words. This self-sustaining loop dramatically increased mental activity. The language allowed the brain to rehearse the past and simulate the future in far greater detail than before. Events could be replayed with commentary, interpretation, and imagined alternatives. This capacity improved learning and social navigation, but it also removed natural stopping points. Before language, mental activity slowed when external stimuli decreased. Silence no longer meant inactivity. It became a canvas for internal speech. From an evolutionary perspective, this was useful. Internal dialogue allowed early humans to plan, reflect, and anticipate without physical action. It reduced mentally for allowing decisions to be tested mentally. First, however, this internal speech was not designed to be quiet. It was designed to be available. The brain learned to keep language ready because communication and planning were always potentially relevant over time. Internal dialogue became automatic. It did not require conscious intention. Words arose spontaneously in response to uncertain or mambo. Importantly, language did not replace older survival systems. It layered on top of them fear, memory, prediction, and social vigilance all gained verbal form. A vague sense of unease could now become a detailed story. A remembered mistake could be replayed with commentary and judgment. Language amplified existing mental process. Once a thought was verbalized internally, it became easier to repeat. Words stabilized thought patterns, making them more likely to return. This increased mental repetition from the brain's perspective. Repetition increased clarity and preparedness. From a modern perspective, it often feels like overthinking. The language made the brain more effective, but it also made it louder. The brain never evolved a mechanism to silence internal speech completely because internal speech improved. Survival. In ancestral environments, talking through possibility mentally could prevent costly errors. When modern humans attempt to rest, the brain continues speaking internally because it does not recognize silence as beneficial. Silence once meant reduced communication and increased risk. The brain fills it with words to maintain control and understanding. This explains why thoughts often become more verbal at night or during stillness. With fewer external inputs, the brain does not slow down. It shifts into narration. This marks a critical step in understanding why the human brain never truly rests. Language turned thought into a continuous process. It allowed the mind to operate without interruption. While this ability made humans uniquely adaptable, it also ensured that mental activity could persist long after the environment became safe. The inner voice remains active because it was never meant to turn off. It was meant to guide, warn, and prepare at all times. Once internal language became established, it did not remain a passive tool. It began to regulate the brain's sense of control. Words allowed experiences to be labeled, categorized. This gave the brain a feeling of mastery over uncertainty. Naming a threat, a mistake, or a possibility made it feel more manageable from an evolutionary perspective. This was adaptive. A brain that could describe what was happening internally could coordinate behavior more effectively. However, this created a dependency. The brain learned to rely on internal speech to maintain orientation and control. When internal dialogue slowed, the brain interpreted this not as rest, but as loss of structure. Silence became unfamiliar. In ancestral environments, silence inside the mind often coincided with external uncertainty. As a result, the brain associated continuous inner narration with safety. It learned that thinking in words reduced ambiguity over time. This association strengthened internal dialogue, became self-sustaining. One thought triggered another, not because action was required, but because continuity itself felt protective. There was always another interpretation to consider, another explanation to refine. This made inner language resistant to interruption. When modern humans attempt to quiet their minds, the brain often reacts by increasing verbal activity. It produces more thoughts to compensate for perceived loss of control. This reaction is automatic. The brain is not choosing to resist rest. It is maintaining a familiar regulatory process. Internal speech also became tightly linked to emotion. Feelings that were once fleeting sensations gained verbal form. A brief discomfort could become a narrative about failure or threat. Language gave emotions duration. Once described internally, they were easier to revisit. This extended their presence in the mind. The brain learned that revisiting emotions verbally helped anticipate future outcomes. This reinforced the loop. Inner dialogue did not merely describe experience, it shaped it. The more the brain talked, the more material it generated. To talk about silence disrupted this loop. so the brain avoided it. Importantly, inner dialogue became a substitute for action. In many cases, thinking replaced doing. Early humans could rehearse responses mentally instead of acting impulsively. This reduced physical risk, however. It also meant that the brain could remain active without resolution. Action once provided closure. Thought did not. This made mental activity persistent even when no action followed. Over time, the brain learned to treat inner speech as necessary work. Resting the body did not signal completion of this work. Quiet moments were reinterpreted as opportunities to think more. This is why the mind often becomes busiest when external demands decrease. Internal language fills the space. The brain uses words to maintain engagement, because engagement once equaled safety in modern life. This manifests as constant mental chatter, yet the brain does not experience this as noise. It experiences it as organizing. The absence of words feels disorganizing. Therefore, the brain continues narrating. Understanding the mind feels difficult. It is not simply about calming emotions. It is about interrupting a regulatory system that has been active for tens of thousands of years. Internal dialogue became the brain's way of staying oriented in an uncertain world. Removing it feels like removing a compass. The brain responds by turning it back on. This explains why silence often triggers more thoughts rather than fewer. The brain is restoring a familiar structure. Language gave humans power over abstraction, but it also bound the mind to continuous verbal processing. This is another reason the human brain never slows down. It learned to speak internally to survive, and survival mechanisms do not disengage easily. As internal language became more dominant, it gradually reshaped how the brain experienced time and rest. Thought no longer unfolded only in response to the present moment. Words allowed the mind to move freely across past, present, and future. This ability expanded human imagination, but it also dissolved natural boundaries. The brain could now revisit the same idea repeatedly, adding new interpretations each time internal dialogue created loops for another to begin. It could restart, revise itself, and continue indefinitely. This looping structure made mental activity persistent, unlike external conversations which eventually pause. Internal speech had no external constraint. The brain did not evolve a mechanism to conclude internal narratives decisively. Clue often required action or resolution in the world. Internal language could continue without either. This is why thinking alone rarely brings finality. Over time, the brain learned to associate continuous internal speech with preparedness. As long as the inner voice was active, the brain felt engaged with reality. When the voice quieted, the brain sensed exposure. This association reinforced the loop. The more the brain spoke internally, the safer it felt. This feedback made inner dialogue resistant to rest. Importantly, internal language began to consume the same attention systems once reserved for the environment. The brain's focus turned inward instead of monitoring surroundings. This self-referential activity required sustained energy. The cortex remained active even in the absence of external input. Sleep reduced awareness, but it did not silence the inner voice completely. Dreams preserved narrative structure. The brain continued telling stories even when consciousness faded. This continuity shows that internal language became embedded deeply into neural processing. It was no longer optional. Modern humans inherit this system unchanged. Thoughts flow not because they are needed, but because the system defaults to language. This creates the experience of a mind that will not slow down. The brain is not searching for answers alone. It is maintaining a familiar mode of operation. Silence interrupts that mode. Therefore, the brain fills it. This explains why many people find mental quiet uncomfortable rather than peaceful. Quiet removes the structure. Language provides. The brain responds by generating more words. This reaction is automatic. It is not a humans coordinate action, avoid mistakes, and survive complex social worlds. That utility ensured its survival across generations. However, in modern life, where immediate survival rarely depends on continuous narration, this same mechanism becomes a source of fatigue. The brain expends energy maintaining internal dialogue without clear benefit. Yet, cannot E-rating mind was safer than a silent one. This evolutionary preference remains embedded. The brain never learned to slow down because slowing down meant losing orientation. Language anchored thought, and thought anchored survival. As long as language operates internally, the mind remains in motion. This completes the exploration of how language and inner speech lock the brain into continuous activity. With this foundation established, the narrative can now move toward understanding how sleep itself evolved, not as a full shutdown, but as another state in which the brain continues working, reinforcing why mental activity never fully stops. Sleep did not evolve as a state of complete mental shutdown. From an evolutionary perspective, fully turning off awareness would have been dangerous. For early humans, sleep occurred in environments where vulnerability was unavoidable. There were no locked doors, no artificial lighting, and no reliable barriers against predators or rival groups. During sleep, the body became less responsive, but the brain could not afford total disengagement. As a result, sleep evolved as a compromised state, reduced physical activity combined with continued internal monitoring. The brain learned to lower responsiveness without losing the ability to detect important signals. This design explains why sleep is light, thriving, not easily interrupted. It also explains why mental activity continues even when consciousness fades. The brain remains partially alert, scanning for changes that might require waking. Individuals who slept too deeply were less likely to respond to danger. Those whose brains maintained some level of vigilance had better chances of waking in time over generations. This trait was favored. The result is a brain that never fully stops working, even during rest. Sleep reduced energy expenditure and allowed physical recovery. Instead, the brain shifted tasks, sensory processing decreased, but internal processes intensified. Memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and threat evaluation continued. These processes required ongoing neural activity. The brain did not treat sleep as absence, but as transition. They are the brain's way of processing information while maintaining a degree of readiness. Dreaming allowed experiences to be reorganized without complete loss of awareness. From an evolutionary standpoint, this was efficient. The brain could learn and adapt while the body rested. However, this meant that mental quiet was never the goal of sleep. Sleep was not designed to stop thought. It was designed to change the form of thought. This distinction matters. Modern humans often expect sleep to shut the mind off completely when it does not. They interpret this as a problem. In reality, continued mental activity during sleep is the expected outcome of an ancient design. The brain remains active because it assumes that danger may still exist even in sleep. It listens. This listening does not require conscious awareness, it operates beneath it. This is why sudden noises can wake a sleeping person instantly. The brain never stopped monitoring. Slowing down too much during sleep would have increased risk. Therefore, evolution did not reward deep mental silence, it rewarded controlled disengagement. This design persists today even in safe environments. The brain behaves as if sleep requires vigilance. It continues working in the background, maintaining readiness. Understanding this reframes the experience of restless sleep and persistent mental activity. It is following rules shaped in environments where sleep without awareness could be fatal. This sets the foundation for understanding why modern sleep often feels insufficient. The brain did not evolve to rest deeply. It evolved to survive the night. Survival demanded ongoing activity, not silence. One of the clearest signs that sleep was never meant to silence the brain is the brain's ability to wake the body almost instantly. When something changes, this rapid awakening response did not evolve by accident. For early humans, the difference between life and death during sleep was often measured in seconds. Perhaps snapping, a sudden movement nearby, or a shift in group behavior could signal immediate danger. The brain adapted by maintaining a monitoring system that remained active even while consciousness was reduced. This system continuously evaluated sensory input at a low level, filtering and abnormal This required an ongoing neural activity. The brain could not shut down completely and then restart quickly enough. It had to stay partially online over time. This ability became deeply embedded. Sleep was structured in cycles that allowed responsiveness to return. Repeats of sleep made awakening easier, while deeper stages were limited in duration. This pattern balanced recovery with safety. The brain learned to never remain unreachable for too long. From an evolutionary standpoint, this was essential. A brain that stayed too deeply disengaged risked missing critical threats. Therefore, sleep architecture evolved to preserve a pathway back to alertness at all times. Even when the mind felt distant or dreamlike, the brain was still evaluating the environment. This explains why sleep is often fragile. Sudden changes in sound, temperature, or movement can break sleep easily. The brain is not being interrupted. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is checking whether conditions remain safe. Importantly, this monitoring system does not distinguish between ancient and modern environments. It responds to unpredictability itself in modern settings. Unpredictability can come from artificial sources. Alarm treats these disruptions as meaningful because it evolved to treat novelty during sleep as potentially dangerous. As a result, mental activity remains high even at night. The brain does not fully disengage because it assumes that disengagement carries risk. This has consequences for how rest feels. Modern humans may sleep for many hours, yet feel mentally unrested. The brain has not stopped working. It has been maintaining readiness. Fatigue accumulates because recovery is partial. The system prioritizes survival over restoration. From an evolutionary perspective, this trade-off made sense. Surviving the night mattered more than feeling refreshed the next day. Therefore, no strong pressure favored deep, uninterrupted mental silence. Instead, evolution favored a brain that could wake quickly and respond immediately. Understanding this helps explain why the brain never truly slows down. Even when unconsciousness sets in, sleep is not an off switch. It is a different mode of operation. The brain remains active, alert to change, and prepared to respond. This continuous readiness reinforces the overall pattern seen throughout human cognition. This perspective reframes common struggles with sleep. Difficulty staying asleep or feeling mentally active at night is not a personal failure. It is the expression of an ancient survival system doing its job. The brain does not rest deeply because it never learned that deep rest was safe. It learned that survival required availability. This insight prepares the ground for the next part of the narrative, which will examine how modern environments continuously activate these ancient sleep-related systems, preventing the brain from ever fully powering down. Because sleep evolved as a state of partial disengagement rather than full shutdown, it carries an inherent limitation. Recovery is never complete. The brain reduces responsiveness, but it does not suspend its core functions throughout the night. Neural systems remain active, cycling between lighter and deeper stages in a pattern shaped by survival needs. This structure ensured that early humans could regain alertness quickly, but it also meant that the brain never experienced prolonged silence. Even in deeper sleep, memory was reorganized. Emotional signals were processed, and threat-related systems remained available. From an evolutionary standpoint, this made sense. The brain prioritized was less important than waking in time. Over thousands of generations, this trade-off became normalized. The brain learned that exhaustion could be tolerated, but unresponsiveness could not. Modern humans often wake after a full night of sleep, feeling mentally tired, not because sleep failed, but because the brain never truly stopped working during the night. It continued processing unresolved information, especially material tied to uncertainty or emotion. Dreams reflect this activity. They're not random interruptions of rest. They are evidence that the brain remains engaged, integrating experiences while maintaining vigilance. Dreaming allows the brain to work without full awareness, but it does not provide silence. The mind continues moving, just along a different path. This explains why sleep does not always reduce mental load. The same systems that keep the brain active during the day continue operating at night. only with altered input. Modern environments intensify this problem. Artificial lighting, irregular schedules, and constant stimulate disrupt the natural cues that want Skype to disengage. As a result, vigilance increases rather than decreases. The brain compensates by staying alert. Even small disruptions can trigger partial awakening because the monitoring systems are already active. This leads to fragmented sleep and incomplete recovery. Over time, the accumulation of partial rest creates a sense of persistent mental fatigue. The brain feels tired, yet it does not slow down. This paradox is a direct outcome of evolutionary design. Sleep was never meant to reset the brain completely. It was meant to preserve life through the night. In modern life, where physical threats are rare, but cognitive demands are constant, this design becomes costly. The brain continues processing information without sufficient opportunity to discharge mental load. Yet it does not recognize this accumulation as a reason to stop in ancestral environments. Stopping vigilance because of fatigue increased risk. Therefore, the brain learned to push through. This explains why modern humans can feel exhausted and restless at the same time. The brain is following ancient rules in a new context. The understanding this helps reframe expectations about rest. The brain's inability to slow down during sleep is not a defect. It is the predictable outcome of a system shaped to remain available. Sleep reduces awareness, but it does not remove responsibility. The brain stays on duty. This completes the exploration of sleep as a compromised state rather than a true shutdown. The human brain never truly rests even at night, because rest was never the goal, survival was. This realization sets the stage for examining how modern life continuously triggers these ancient systems, keeping the brain active long after danger has disappeared. Modern life did not create a new kind of brain activity. It amplified an ancient one. The human brain still operates using systems shaped in environments where signals were rare, slow, or environments. A sudden sound, a movement, or a change in routine usually mattered. The brain evolved to treat novelty as information. Modern environments, however, are saturated with novelty. Lights, sounds, notifications, schedules, and artificial rhythms continuously stimulate the brain's detection system. Instead, they respond by increasing activity. The brain interprets continuous stimulation as continuous uncertainty. It assumes that something important might be happening and that vigilance is required. This keeps neural circuits active even when the body is still. Importantly, the brain does not evaluate a flashing screen, a sudden vibration, or an unexpected interruption. Activate the same oriented mechanisms that once responded to environmental threats. The brain treats unpredictability as risk. In ancestral environments, unpredictability often preceded. Developed, the brain responds by maintaining readiness. There is no clear signal that says it is safe to disengage. Even periods of apparent rest are filled with residual stimulation. Artificial lighting extends daytime into the night, weakening the natural cues that once told the brain when to reduce activity. The brain remains uncertain. It compensates by staying active. This creates a state of continuous low-level alertness. The brain is not reacting to immediate threats, but to ongoing ambiguity. This ambiguity keeps prediction, memory, and attention systems engaged. The result is a mind that never fully settles. Modern tools intensify this effect and exploit the brain's sensitivity to novelty. Each new piece of information triggers orientation responses. The brain shifts focus, repeatedly increasing cognitive load. This constant switching prevents the natural tapering of mental activity. The brain remains in a state of readiness, but the environment has become predictability. In evolutionary terms, predictability allowed rest, and predictability demanded vigilance. Modern life leans heavily toward the latter. Even in physically safe spaces, the brain perceives ongoing change. This perception keeps ancient survival circuits active. The brain does not slow down because it does not recognize modern environments as stable. It reacts to input frequency rather than actual danger. This mismatch between ancient design and modern stimulation is a central reason why mental activity feels relentless today. The brain is doing what it was built to do: respond to change. The problem is that change no longer carries the same meaning, yet the brain has no mechanism to adjust for this difference. It continues interpreting constant input as a reason to stay alert. This sets the stage for understanding why modern humans struggle to feel mental quiet. Even in moments of rest, the environment does not allow the brain to conclude that monitoring can stop. This modern amplification of ancient vigilance explains a crucial part of why the human brain never slows down. The human brain does not possess a reliable filter for determining which forms of stimulation are meaningful and which are not. It evolved in environments where most signals carried potential importance. A sound, a movement, or a sudden change usually meant something had happened in the physical world. Because false alarms were less costly than missed threats, the brain learned to respond broadly. This bias remains intact. Modern stimuli exploit it unintentionally. Background noise, artificial light, and constant information. Updates all triggered at ORINES. The brain treats them as signals requiring evaluation, even when they have no survival relevance. This creates a continuous cycle of attention shifts. Each shift demands energy over time. These demands accumulate. The brain remains engaged, not because each stimulus matters, but because the system cannot afford to ignore them all. Ignoring signals was historically dangerous. Therefore, the brain errs on the side of engagement. Importantly, the brain responds to frequency and unpredictability more than content. A repeated interruption, even if trivial, keeps attention systems active. Predictable environments offer sustained predictability. Patterns are interrupted constantly. The brain responds by maintaining readiness. This readiness does not feel dramatic. It feels like background tension. The mind stays busy without clear focus. The brain also struggles to complete processing when inputs arrive faster than they can be integrated. Thoughts remain unfinished. Memory systems keep material active because closure has not been reached. The brain is holding information open, waiting for resolution that never arrives in ancestral environments. Unresolved information usually resolved quickly through action or observation. In modern life, information often arrives without consequence. The brain does not know this. It continues to prepare for outcomes that do not exist. Attention is pulled outward repeatedly, then inward to process what was received. Neither process completes fully. The result is sustained mental motion. Fatigue does not stop this cycle. The brain interprets fatigue as reduced capacity, as permission to disengage. When capacity drops, vigilance often increases to compensate. The brain is trying to protect function by staying active over time. This creates a sense of constant busyness without productivity. Modern humans often interpret this as poor focus or anxiety. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do in an environment filled with signals. The problem is not stimulation itself, but the lack of meaningful resolution. The brain remains active because it never receives a clear signal that monitoring can safely stop. Even rest periods are saturated with residual input. The brain continues responding because it has no evolved mechanism. The brain is not ignoring modern stimuli because ignoring signals was never rewarded. It continues scanning, evaluating, and holding information open. This constant engagement reinforces the broader pattern seen throughout human cognition. The brain never slows down because it never received confirmation that the environment has become stable. The brain responds with endless vigilance. This dynamic deepens the understanding of why mental restlessness feels unavoidable today. Ancient systems are operating in a world that never stops signaling. The brain remains active because it was built to respond to change, not to ignore it. When stimulation becomes continuous, the brain begins to lose one of its most important regulatory mechanisms. Sustained attention in ancestral environments. Attention could remain focused for long periods because signals were limited and meaningful. Once a threat was identified or a task was underway, The brain could stay with it until resolution. Modern environment disrupt this pattern. Simulation arrives in short, unpredictable bursts, pulling attention away repeatedly. The brain adapts by fragmenting focus, instead of deepening rapidly from one input to another. Each shift leaves cognitive residue. Thoughts are started, but not finished. The brain keeps them active because closure has not been achieved. This accumulation creates a sense of mental clutter. The brain feels busy because many processes remain open simultaneous. Importantly, the brain does not experience this as inefficiency. From an evolutionary perspective, if one line of information became important, it was already accessible. Modern fragmentation exaggerates this tendency. The brain holds too many possibilities at once, none of them resolve fully. This prevents the natural slowing that once followed completed action. Even when the body rests, the brain is managing unfinished business. The brain remains alert because it assumes that unresolved information could become relevant. This assumption was historically valid. In modern life it is rarely true, yet the brain applies the same rules over time. Fragmented attention leads to persistent mental fatigue. The rest does not clear this load because stimulation resumes quickly. There is no extended period of stability that signals completion. Without completion, the brain does not disengage. This explains why modern rest often feels shallow. The brain never receives confirmation that it can let go. Even silence can feel crowded because internal processes. The mind replays fragments of information searching for coherence. This search does not end because the environment keeps changing. The brain is trapped in a cycle of monitoring without resolution. This cycle reinforces the experience of a mind that never slows down. It is not driven by urgency alone, but by fragmentation. The brain is constantly preparing without ever concluding. This dynamic completes the picture of how modern stimulation locks ancient vigilance into overdrive. The brain is responding appropriately to its inputs. The problem lies in the input stem dulls is overwhelmed by abundance. The result is continuous activity without rest. Understanding this helps reframe modern mental exhaustion. It is not a personal weakness. It is the predictable outcome of an ancient brain operating in an environment that never allows attention to settle. With this foundation established, the narrative now turns toward the deeper question of why slowing the brain down can feel threatening rather than relieving. Even when rest is desired for most of human history, slowing down was not associated with safety. It was associated with exposure. When movement stopped and attention faded, predators approached quietly. Rival groups took advantage of inattention. Environmental changes went unnoticed. Because of this, the brain learned to interpret reduced activity as a potential threat. Slowing down did not signal rest, it signaled risk. This association became deference for readiness over calm. Even when the body was still, the mind remained active to compensate. This compensation was protective. It ensured that some form of awareness persisted when physical engagement decreased. As a result, mental activity became the substitute for physical vigilance. When modern humans attempt to slow their minds, the brain reacts. It responds by increasing activity rather than decreasing it. This reaction feels counterintuitive, but it follows ancient logic. Reduced monitoring historically increased danger. Therefore, the brain learned to resist it. Importantly, the brain does not evaluate whether the present environment is optic for stimulation, stillness, quiet, and lack of stimulation. The brain fills these states with thought to maintain control. Thought becomes the replacement for action. As long as the mind is active, the brain feels engaged with the environment. When thought slows, the brain senses loss of grip. This sensation triggers alert systems. The brain produces more thoughts to restore engagement. This is why attempts to relax often lead to increased mental chatter. The brain is not malfunctioning. It is defending a familiar state over generations. Brains that resisted disengagement survived more reliably. They noticed changes earlier and responded faster. This selection pressure shaped neural regulation. Slowing down became associated with vigilance. Modern humans inherit this mapping unchanged. When the mind quiets, the brain interprets it as neglect. It increases monitoring to compensate. This explains why relaxation can feel uncomfortable at first. Calmness removes stimulation that the brain uses as evidence of safety. In the absence of that evidence, the brain generates internal activity. It is attempting to recreate the conditions of alertness it trusts. This reaction is strongest when uncertainty is high. The brain uses thought to reduce uncertainty. When thought slows, uncertainty feels unresolved. The brain responds by reactivating prediction, pry. This keeps the system running from an evolutionary perspective. This behavior was correct. It minimized risk. But modern life, it creates restlessness. Yet the brain has no updated rule set. It still treats slowing down as dangerous. This is a critical insight. The difficulty of mental rest is not a lack of discipline or technique. It is a conflict between ancient survival rules and modern expectations. The brain does not know that safety can exist without vigilance. It learned the opposite. Therefore, it protects itself by staying active. Understanding this reframes the experience of restlessness. The brain is not resisting peace. It is guarding against a threat that no longer exists. This sets the foundation for examining how this threat perception shapes emotional responses and why calm can feel unsettling rather than soothing. When quiet emerges, the brain does not automatically interpret it as safety. Instead, evaluate what has been removed. Sound, movement, and activity once served as indicators that the environment was being monitored. 2. In ancestral settings, silence often preceded danger. Predators move quietly. Groups approach without warning. A sudden lack of familiar noise could signal that something was wrong. Because of this, the brain learned to associate stillness with ambiguity required attention. The brain responded by increasing internal alertness. This response persists today. Second, when external stimulation decreases, internal systems intensify. Thought replaces sound. Memory replaces movement. The brain creates activity to compensate for the loss of engagement. From the brain's perspective, quiet without engagement is unsafe. The brain is searching for confirmation that nothing has been missed without external input. It turns inward. It scans memory for unresolved risks and projects future possibilities to regain a sense of control. This process often manifests as anxiety, but anxiety is not the cause. It is the byproduct, the vigilant. The brain is not signaling danger. It is preventing it. In evolutionary terms, this strategy worked. Maintaining alertness during quiet periods increased survival. The brain did not evolve to enjoy stillness. It evolved to survive it. This difference matters. Modern expectations often treat calm as inherently safe. The brain does not share this assumption. It treats calm as a state that requires verification until safety is confirmed. Monitoring continues. Internal thought provides that monitoring over time, this pattern becomes automatic. The brain does not wait for conscious permission to activate. It feels silence reflexively. This reflex is strongest among monsters. These conditions resemble ancestral vulnerability. The brain responds accordingly. It increases internal activity to maintain orientation. This is why anxiety often intensifies at night or during moments of inactivity. The brain is not reacting to specific threats. It is reacting to reduced intubation. The absence of input is interpreted as potential risk. Thought becomes noise that replaces silence. Importantly, the brain does not distinguish between useful and unproductive thought in this context. Any activity is better than none. Activity signals engagement. Engagement signals safety. This rule was reliable for most of human history. In modern life, it becomes problematic. Quiet environments are often safe, but the brain does not update this assessment easily. It continues applying ancient logic. As a result, attempts to slow down can trigger unease. Calm removes the signals the brain relies on. The brain responds by restoring activity. This cycle explains why rest can feel elusive. The brain equates stillness with exposure. It fills stillness with thought to protect itself. Understanding this reveals that anxiety during calm is not a failure to relax. It is the brain performing a protective function. It is maintaining engagement in the absence of external cues. This reframes the struggle with mental quiet of the It is the echo of an ancient survival rule that equated awareness with life. This insight prepares the way for the next step in the narrative, which will examine how the brain reacts when slowing down becomes unavoidable, and how resistance to rest can ultimately deepen fatigue rather than prevent danger. When slowing down becomes unavoidable, the brain does not surrender easily. Instead of releasing control, it often tightens it. Fatigue, quiet, or stillness remove external structure, and the brain responds by increasing internal effort. This creates a paradoxical loop. The more exhausted the brain becomes, the harder it works to maintain vigilance. From an evolutionary perspective, this made sense. Fatigue did not signal safety. It signaled weakness. Weakness increased. Therefore, the brain learned to compensate for tiredness by staying alert. It pushed through exhaustion because stopping was historically dangerous. This logic remains embedded. Modern humans often reach a point where rest is necessary, yet the brain resists it. The resistance is not conscious. It is automatic. The brain is attempting to prevent perceived exposure by maintaining activity. This effort deepens fatigue rather than resolving it. Thought continues, but clarity decreases. The mind feels heavy, repetitive, and stuck. This state is not restful, yet it is not fully alert. It is the outcome of a system designed to endure, not to recover. Over time, this loop becomes self-reinforceration, incomplete restoration. Increases fatigue triggers more vigilance. The cycle continues. The brain never receives a signal that it is safe to stop because it equates stopping with loss of protection. Modern environments worsen this pattern. There are few natural boundaries that clearly mark completion. The brain remains engaged because nothing tells it that engagement is no longer required. Even when the body rests, the mind stays active, attempting to manage unresolved demands. This creates chronic mental tiredness. Importantly, the brain does not interpret this tiredness as failure. In evolutionary terms, endurance was rewarded. Surviving despite fatigue increased reproductive success. Therefore, the brain learned to tolerate prolonged strain. It did not evolve to pry comfort. It evolved to prioritize continuity. This is why slowing down can feel threatening. It interrupts a system that equates activity with survival. The brain reacts by restoring motion. Thought becomes the last line of defense. As long as the mind is moving, the brain feels engaged with the world. When thought slows, engagement feels lost. This loss triggers alertness. The result is a mind that resists rest even when rest is necessary. Understanding this cycle reframes modern mental exhaustion. It is not simply the result of doing too much. It is the result of a brain that does not trust stopping. The brain is not broken. It is following rules shaped in environments where stopping meant danger. Those rules persist even when danger is absent. This explains why rest can feel shallow and why mental fatigue accumulates without relief. The brain remains active because it has no evolved mechanism to recognize that safety can exist without vigilance. It continues working to prevent a threat that no longer arrives. This completes the exploration of why slowing down feels unsafe. The human brain never slows down, not because it cannot, but because it believes it should not. This belief was once accurate in modern life. It becomes costly. With this understanding in place, the narrative is ready to move into the final chapter, where the focus will shift toward meaning, adaptation, and how recognizing these ancient patterns can change the way modern humans relate to their restless minds. At this point in the narrative, a crucial shift must occur, not toward solutions and not toward closure, but toward understanding. The human brain's refusal to slow down is not an error to be fixed, it is a pattern to be recognized. For most of human history, survival depended on alignment with this pattern. The brain learned rules that worked in unstable environments. Stay alert, stay engaged, never assume safety too early. These rules were reinforced across generations. They shaped how attention, memory, emotion, and thought interact. Modern humans inherit this system intact. The problem is that the environment no longer matches the conditions under which the rules were formed. This mismatch creates tension. The brain behaves as if danger may appear at any moment. While the body lives in relative safety, understanding this match changes the meaning of mental restlessness. It shifts the experience from personal failure. The brain is not malfunctioning. It is doing what it was shaped to do in a world that no longer exists. This recognition does not immediately quiet the mind, but it changes the relationship with it. When restlessness is interpreted as a signal of danger, it triggers resistance. When it is understood as an ancient reflex, it loses some of its urgency. The brain's activity can be observed rather than fought. This distinction matters. Fighting the brain reinforces the very vigilance it is trying to reduce. The brain interprets conflict as threat. It responds by increasing activity. It introduces a different signal, awareness without urgency. From an evolutionary perspective, awareness was always useful. Urgency was situational. Modern life blurs the two. The brain reacts urgently to conditions that no longer require it. Recognizing this allows space for a different response. Not control, but accommodation. Not silence, but perspective. The goal is not to force the brain to slow down, but to understand why it speeds up when the cause is understood. The reaction changes. The brain may still produce thoughts, but those thoughts no longer demand immediate action. They become information rather than alarms. This reframing carries educational value. It teaches that the restless mind is not an enemy, it is a legacy shaped by survival, not comfort. Modern humans often seek techniques to shut the mind off. This pursuit can backfire because it treats activity as a problem rather than a feature. Understanding treats activity as context-dependent. It allows modern humans to recognize when vigilance is unnecessary without demanding that it disappear. This shift does not resolve everything. It opens a different way of relating to mental activity. The brain remains active, but the meaning assigned to that activity changes. This is the beginning of adaptation, not resolution. Evolution shaped the brain slowly. While recognizing the origin of mental restlessness, modern humans can begin to coexist with it rather than resist it. This coexistence does not promise silence. It promises clarity, and clarity alters experience even when activity remains. This sets the foundation for the final movement of the narrative, where the focus will turn toward the open question that remains unanswered. If the brain was never meant to slow down, what does it mean to live well with a mind that never stops? Living with a brain that never truly slows down requires a shift in expectation rather than a demand for change. For most of human history, the goal was not inner quiet. The goal was alignment with reality as it was. Experienced, uncertain, shifting, and often unforgiving, the brain learned to meet that reality with constant engagement. Modern humans, however, often expect the mind to behave as an object that can be switched off at will. When this expectation fails, frustration follows. The frustration adds another layer of tension. The brain interprets it as conflict, and conflict reinforces vigilance. Understanding the origin of mental activity changes this dynamic. When activity is no longer treated as a problem to eliminate, it becomes something to observe. Observation alters the brain's response. The brain is highly sensitive to interpretation. When thoughts are treated as alarms, the system escalates. When they are treated as signals without urgency, the system often stabilizes. This is not because the brain has been silenced, but because it has not been challenged in evolutionary terms. Resistance signals, threat, acceptance signals, assessment. The brain relaxes more easily in the presence of assessment than in the presence of force. This does not mean mental activity changes. It means the relationship to that activity changes. Thoughts can continue without demanding reaction. Memory can surface without requiring correction. Prediction can occur without driving action. This distinction is subtle but important. It reframes mental rest not as absence of thought, but as absence of urgency was the true driver of survival behavior. Without urgency, activity loses its sharp edge. The brain remains active, but it no longer needs to defend itself. This perspective carries educational value. It teaches that calm is not something the brain produces on command. Calm emerges when the brain no longer believes it is being tested. Modern life constantly tests intention, performance, and identity. Understanding their origin reduces their authority. The brain may still speak, but it no longer needs to shout. This is not a technique. It is a reorientation. It does not promise a quiet mind. It offers a different kind of rest from struggle. Evolution did not design the brain for silence, but it did design it to respond to meaning. When meaning changes, response changes. Recognizing that the brain's activity once ensured survival gives that activity context. Calm softens reaction. Over time, this can alter experience, not by stopping thought, but by changing what thought signifies. This is how adaptation begins, not by rewriting biology, but by understanding it. The restless mind becomes less threatening when it is understood as familiar rather than dangerous. This understanding does not end the story. It opens a question that remains unresolved. If the brain was shaped to never slow down, and modern life no longer requires constant vigilance, how should humans live with a mind that continues to operate by ancient rules? At the end of this exploration, no solution is offered, because no solution truly exists. The human brain did not evolve with an endpoint in mind. It evolved with continuity as its priority for most of human history. Staying active meant staying alive. Vigilance preserved bodies. Memory preserved coordination. And social awareness preserved belonging. Each layer added capability, but each layer also added motion. Together they formed a mind that rarely stops. Modern life did not create this condition. It revealed it. When physical survival became easier, mental motion became more visible. What once blended basing into daily struggle now stands out as restlessness. The brain continues operating as it always has, but the environment no longer demands it in the same way. This creates discomfort, confusion, and the persistent feeling that something is wrong. The brain is consistent. It is modern expectations that conflict with ancient design. Understanding this does not quiet the mind. It reframes it. It allows mental activity to exist without being interpreted as failure. It removes the demand for silence and replaces it with curiosity. Curiosity changes posture. Instead of fighting thought, instead of trying to stop motion, one can notice its rhythm. This does not end activity, but it alters its meaning. Meaning shapes experience. A restless mind interpreted as danger produces perspective. Perspective does not remove fatigue, but it reduces fear. Fear was always the fuel of vigilance. Without fear, vigilance loses urgency. The brain may still think, still remember, still predict, but it does so without the same pressure. This is not peace in the traditional sense. It is alignment, allianion between what the brain is and what is expected of it. Modern humans often ask how to slow the brain down. A different question may be more honest. If the brain was never meant to slow down, if its constant motion once protected life and shaped civilization, what does it mean to live well with a mind that never truly stops?